Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy takes center stage at the UN General Assembly. He warns world leaders that Russia will keep driving its war with his nation wider and deeper unless it's stopped. So let's talk more about that speech and also Donald Trump's shift in tone on Ukraine. We're joined by Aurel Braun, Professor of International Relations at the University of Toronto. And he's also Center Associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. Always good to see you on the show. Let's start with President Zelenskyy. Now, he warned that Putin will keep driving the war forward wider and deeper, if not stop. Now, this is not his first warning. He said this in other forms perhaps before, but given the incursions we saw in Estonia, in Romania, and Poland, do you think his message now carries a new urgency and tone? Or are NATO's European members going, we know we're trying to do all we can?
It does carry more urgency because he has warned in general before, and now the Europeans are beginning to see actual prodding by the Russians. They see that the Putin regime doesn't just have ambitions in Ukraine, but it has wider goals. And that this is not only about Ukraine losing territory, it is about Russia trying to damage or destroy the NATO alliance. And this is why what Mr. Zelenskyy said at the United Nations is important. It was also quite striking how he went after the UN, because the United Nations is an extraordinarily expensive and large organization whose central purpose, the raison d'etre, has been peace and security, and has failed miserably in that central function, the way the League of Nations has failed. The United Nations spends 60-70% of its time pursuing a small democracy in the Middle East, while hundreds of thousands of people are dying in Darfur and in the Congo, where China is occupying Tibet, where the Uyghurs are persecuted, and Russia has invaded Ukraine, and they haven't done anything. So Mr. Zelenskyy also pointed out, you can't rely on the United Nations. This is a world where power makes a difference. And therefore, his suggestion was that Ukraine has to be strong, and Ukraine has to be strong together with its allies, and that means the United States as well as Europe. And this follows what you have pointed out was a change in tone on the part of the President of the United States. The big question is whether this was just a change in tone or will it lead to a change in policy? And there, I must say, there is a good deal of skepticism.
Okay. And this whole slamming of the United Nations by President Zelenskyy, is it in sort of the vein of President Trump, who, in the previous day called climate change a con job, slammed the UN as well? We know that the United States has some newfound trust and confidence in Zelenskyy's leadership. Are they a little more together now?
In part, this may well be that Mr. Zelenskyy wants to signal his agreement with many of the things that President Trump has said. But I think the frustration with the United Nations on the part of many democratic countries is growing daily, and it is evident to anyone who looks at the League of Nations and compares it to the United Nations, how massively the UN has basically failed in its central function. But it was too polite to bring this up. Mr. Zelenskyy exhibited the utter frustration that they've had, where China and Russia sit on the Security Council, and they basically have immunity. They are above international law. And so what he pointed out was that we are in an era of power politics. If you are in an era of power politics, then you need to rely on your own power and that of the allies. And the allies in this case are the European countries, the democratic countries around the world, and of course, United States.
Professor Braun, Volodymyr Zelenskyy and other senior Ukrainian officials say this U-turn, this pivot is good news. They're saying it publicly anyway. I'm wondering whether it really is good news, because it does mean that the war carries on. And wouldn't Kyiv really just prefer or want a just and lasting end right now?
Mr. Trump wants to be able to say that he has settled the wars. He claims he has settled 6 or 7 wars that he already deserves the Nobel Prize. He is in a relentless pursuit of the Nobel Prize. And the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, who is a man of exalted rhetoric but very little achievement, teased Mr. Trump by saying, well, you have to stop a certain kind of war in the Middle East to get the Nobel Prize, or the war in Ukraine. And it is, I think, wise to look carefully at not only what Mr. Trump said at the United Nations, but what he also said on social media shortly afterwards, because often his thoughts are elaborated on social media. And what he said was that Ukraine can win the war, provided it gets sufficient help from the European Union. And that, I think, is important. He didn't say that the United States was going to help them. He didn't say that the United States was going to send massive armaments or even sell massive armaments, or sell armaments that Ukraine wants to buy, like ATAC-Ms, which are longer range and could hit key Russian marshalling points deep inside the country. United States has said that they are willing to sell weapons to the European states, and they may transfer those weapons. But can United States, or will United States, send enough of these weapons over? Crucially also, United States needs to provide intelligence, logistics, communication that the European countries do not yet have. Yes, it is the case now that in Germany, they are going to spend and have begun to spend hundreds of billions of euros. That the Nordic states, including Finland, crucial state that has given up its neutrality in the face of a Russian threat and join NATO, are also massively arming. Poland is doubling its armed forces. And therefore, there is that European potential, but it takes time, as I noted before, to scale up. So the United States has to provide that bridge. And we're not sure that Mr. Trump is willing to do that. Mr. Trump also had said that the Europeans, the NATO countries, should shoot down Russian aircraft that have intruded on European nations' airspace. And that has happened with Russia prodding and probing to see where the weaknesses were, as well as drone interference with that to close down airports in some of the Nordic states. But if should that happen, would Mr. Trump be willing to back up the European allies? Because there would be a crisis. And so you see a situation where Mr. Putin still does not believe that the United States will come down really hard on him. And in some ways, when we look at Mr. Putin's policies, it is this kind of paradoxical combination of confidence and desperation. Mr. Putin may suspect that he has a relatively short window to win or to intimidate the Europeans before the Europeans are sufficiently well armed that they can stand up, they can take over from the United States, and that together they can really prevail. So Mr. Trump has an important role to play, and in many ways he continues to remain a mystery, someone who changes his mind very frequently. The tone change now is potentially significant, but potential has to be realized.
Yeah, we were meant to ask you as well how long this about face you think would last, but we're out of time, and on that, only time will tell. Thank you, Aurel Braun, who is Professor of International Relations at the University of Toronto and the Center Associate at Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, Harvard University.